Well, let's see here. Good evening. I think we're starting a couple minutes earlier than normal, but this will give time for people to come on. But my camera's way over here, so I'm gonna get up for a second. Okay. How's that? Well, from my perspective, that looks a little bit better. I'm, tend to like being in the middle versus off to one side. But good evening, and it's a couple minutes before we'll get started with the lecture. If you are joining by, later on, not live, and you're watching a video, want to say thank you. And if you are just coming on and you're joining live, I was just talking with Sean a little bit about this series, and as I look at things, depending on how tonight goes, we're getting close to wrapping up. Just probably a few more sessions, 2 or 3 to begin. It depends on how tonight goes. Kathy Sands sent me an encouraging email again. Thanks, Kathy. And with the thought of thinking about doing kind of a single talk that kind of wraps this all up, and so I've been sitting in that, and I think, I'd like to do that, and so that's kind of where I'd be heading towards the end. I think I'll pull in a couple of things from my conclusion, because the conclusion is kind of that part when you do the dissertation where you had your hypothesis, and then you really report on what you learned. And so I think that'll all work itself well together. Few reminders. If you're catching up, I think it's easier to do this through the videos on the website. So you go to www.westsidechurchrichland.org, and then you'll put on videos, and you'll see the Cruciform Way, and that's the easiest way just to make sure you've got everything in order. They're all nice and in a row, and they're easy to access that way. It's 6:30, and one of the things that I've done with this lecture series, and you may have never even noticed, but I've been trying to make this accessible to a larger audience, and in that I haven't begun with prayer. Just in case there's somebody who's a non-Christian and it's a topic, but I would want you to know that I pray for all of you and for this material, and have prayed for it, and unabashedly this is Christian, because we are really talking about humility as it's presented by Jesus Christ, and we are where we are right now, and I've been kind of excited to get to this place, is to talk about some of the concrete benefits of cultivating humility. This is part of the argument of my dissertation, is this idea of how do we cultivate humility when called to be a leader. And in this is the part where, a little bit bumping up against, let's go all the way back to Augustine, that I believe humility is a work of grace, but grace is not opposed to effort, it's opposed to an attitude of earning. That comes from Dallas Willard. And so we're going to come at this with the sense of going, the type of character transformation that is needed for us to live into life that's really life, and to become the best version of ourselves can only come through Jesus Christ. But we can participate and keep in step with the Holy Spirit. We can learn this divine dance, and there are ways for us to learn about humility. And I think many of these are things that can be universally applicable to all human beings. You don't have to have a commitment to Jesus, but I really think that a commitment to Jesus is ultimately foundational of really you becoming who you're supposed to be. I think Jesus wants us all to be leaders, and he wants us to use our power and influence in some way to help serve others and draw them towards life, which means drawing them towards himself. So we are, I introduced to you last time, as we just kind of got into this topic of, okay, we've been doing a literature review. We started with books about leadership. We were asking the question, do humility and leadership go together? Well, they do. There's good arguments that they do, but not everybody sees it. And a part of that is the way that you come at leadership. And so we did this dive into looking at leadership literature and different ways that it analyzes just how do you approach leadership. Some that focus more on the leader, some that focus on the organizations, some that focus on the person leading, some that focus on really the skills of the leader. And all of those will play into this part about being able to see whether humility and leadership go together. Burgeoning literature is supporting of the idea, especially the work of Jim Collins. But more than just leadership is really understanding humility, and that caused us to do then the dive into humility and to kind of begin to listen to all of this literature around humility. And one of the unique things is that not a lot has been written, so it's a little bit easier to get all of our arms wrapped around it. And we walk through the history of understanding the virtue. We looked at Christian tradition, focused in on monasticism, starting with Augustine, and then we worked through Benedict and Bernard. We looked at then more modern treatments, and then we looked at philosophy, and then we came back to leadership. And now we're coming and we're saying, okay, what are the actual benefits of humility? And out of all of this literature, why should we really pursue cultivating it? And especially the leadership literature, but all of this literature gave supporting reasons. And what I decided to do was to answer this question in some very concrete ways, but also to draw on some specific books that I thought were some of the most important about naming the answer in the way that they did. And instead of rehashing what we'd already done, introduce something, and I kind of save these things for here. And in particular, this book, The Road to Character by David Brooks. And David Brooks is an accomplished author, as well as a news commentator. He's on PBS, and he is a Christian, and yet he speaks to a broader audience, and he makes this argument, and it's coming out of the Christian tradition. But he's also making an argument for people who aren't just Christians to see the wisdom that's found in the Christian tradition. And with this, I'm going to give you a little bit of a more detailed Cliff Notes version of a book review of this book, The Road to Character. And it may be one that you would want to read. I found it very, very helpful, very inspiring. Now, my first argument is one of the benefits of humility is that humility is the road to character. And this very much affirmed through the monastic tradition. This is why they pursued humility, the central goal of the spiritual pursuit, for 1,000 years. This virtue in particular would help conform us and transform us into the likeness of Christ. And that is about character transformation. So, let me share with you, and coming back to this, so he's pointing people specifically to humility as the road to character. And then he reminds us, and this is important, humility is not about a temperament or a personality type. And this is where he's beginning to make his argument about humility. It's not just somebody who is a wallflower who thinks less of themselves. It's it's something more. And what he says is this. He says, the path of humility is the way of moral realism. And this is one of the things that he's trying to do, is confront us with the reality. And we'll talk a little bit more, but the name that he gives is that the problem is, in our culture today, in our society today, is that we moved into what he calls the big me culture, this narcissistic culture, and we moved away from the pursuit of character, which is walking the way of humility. And here, as he talks about humility as the way of moral realism, one of the things that he's doing is he's affirming that it's open to all personality types. Now, the way that he makes that argument is that throughout his book, he gives us these pictures about characteristics of this road to character and what humility looks like by actually telling you the story of different lives and the way that they exemplified in some way this road to character, and they were all different types of people. Even within the tradition of moral realism, there are many differences of temperament, technique, tactics, and taste. There's a lot of room for each person to chart a unique path. But each of the lives in this book started with a deep vulnerability and undertook a lifelong effort to transcend that vulnerability. Each person traveled down into the valley of humility in order to ascend the heights of tranquility and self-respect. And so, it's a road to character, but remember, character isn't about personality type. It's not about an introvert or an extrovert. It's not about being a thinker or a feeler. It's not about somebody who's very gregarious or somebody who's more reserved. Humility is a character that every one of those personality types can cultivate, and they'll express a little bit differently. But part of it is that this moral realism, this humility, in the end, what it does is it helps you come to the end of yourself, and you realize, this is his argument, that it moves you out of selfishness and moves you into a path of a bigger world where you have something to contribute and you have a place to serve. Lots of similarities there with the biblical idea of kapaphrsune. Not all of it. And this is again one of the weaknesses that we find so often in modern treatments of humility, is that it really doesn't understand the biblical idea in its fullness. But every once in a while, these works they grab a hold of and they get it, and especially when it gets tied to the idea of service and it keeps that social dimension. That humility isn't really just thinking lowly of myself, but it's putting me in a place where I'm disregarding my status, my privilege, because I have something larger to do. There's others out there, and those others become people in which I should serve, I should love, I should contribute. Brooks's understanding of humility is much like the leadership literature. The Bible is a major source of his understanding, but he doesn't evidence a rigorous engagement with the biblical text, nor understanding what the call of humility meant to the Bible's original audience. Nonetheless, Brooks provides a valuable resource filled with wisdom from the Christian tradition, especially in giving some sense of understanding how humility might be formed in us. According to Brooks, humility is a positive virtue, in part because it helps negate our weaknesses, but not merely a negation against vices. Humility is also beautiful and good because it aligns us with reality. Brooks captures Bernard's warm understanding of humility as he affirms that humility shows us we are ultimately saved by grace, and that's a quote. And and this is that part where going through and you're reading these things and you start paying attention to people and they're like, okay, they're getting it. Sometimes it's because they're reading some of the same original sources. And other times, this is the work of God and bringing people into truth. And sometimes we rediscover what somebody else had discovered and we didn't even know it. Not only does he understand that there is a warm side of humility, but he also understands that humility is social in its means. He writes, no person can achieve self-mastery on his or her own. Individual will, reason, compassion, and character are not strong enough to consistently defeat selfishness, pride, greed, and self-deception. And I want you to think about this. I mean, this becomes the part where, we come to an idea. Humility is the road to character. And we're talking about, and this is the part where we're reading a book, they're presenting their ideas, he happens to be a Christian, and then we're thinking through this ourselves as Christians. And here's this idea. Does this match up biblically? Yeah, I think it does. Okay, now let's think about this. Let's listen to what they have to say, and then let's turn our own brains on and think through this ourselves about how does this fit? Okay, no person by themselves can come to this place of self-mastery. We will not by ourselves defeat selfishness, pride, greed, and self-deception. No, that makes a lot of sense. In fact, the more that you live into Christian community, you realize, okay, I put on rose-colored glasses when I look at myself. I am prone to self-deception. I need some people to speak truth in my life. And sure enough, that matches up really well with wisdom and advice on how to become a better leader. That one of the great dangers for leadership is, and this is in line with what we heard from Bill Robinson, where you don't stay connected. You don't mind the gap between you as the leader and the people that you're leading. And then as that gap separates, you aren't able to really see yourself clearly, and you don't have anybody who's helping you see yourself clearly. Everybody needs redemptive assistance from the outside. From God, family, friends, ancestors, rules, traditions, institutions, and exemplars. Just good, solid wisdom. Humility is social in nature. The only way I can become humble is by being in relationship with others. And so we see this tying together, this humility and moving us into a social dimension. Humility is also not only social in its means, it gets formed in community, but it's also social in its goals, according to Brooks. No good life is possible unless it is organized around a vocation. A vocation is not found by looking within and finding your passion. It is found by looking without and asking what life is asking us. Now, this is where you see somebody who's writing for a general audience and isn't, while he's a Christian. And the language of vocation is the language of calling. And we don't believe in the idea of an impersonal call as if the universe, some abstract idea, is speaking to us. What we believe in as Christians is that there is a personal God, and he has a call on our lives. He has a purpose for you and for me, and the Holy Spirit wants to lead us and guide us into the purposes that God has planned for us, and that is our vocation. Now, sometimes we'll end up earning a salary with the vocation, but it's not necessarily the case. The most important thing that we do is what God calls us to do, and that's where you listen to what he has to say, and then you think about it. No good life is possible unless it is organized around a vocation, and the truly good life is organized around your call from God. A vocation is not found by looking within and finding your passion, though what he's guarding against here is as if you only look within. One of the ways that you discern your calling is by understanding who God has created you to be, and looking at your passions as one of those places. But sometimes God acts in some very surprising ways. I think I've shared this before. I would have never imagined that God would have called me to be somebody who gets up in front of people and speaks. I didn't have any interest in it. Still don't like doing it all that much unless I'm teaching, unless it's about proclaiming the truth of the gospel, unless it's about sharing Jesus. I am getting up, doing announcements, just, I have fun, other people. But, that's the part where it's just like, sometimes you'll be surprised in the call, but in the end, for me, it does end up touching on a passion. And so he's giving this advice. We're listening to it. We realize he's writing this general piece. He is a Christian. He does speak out of the Christian tradition. And we're going to baptize this a little bit into really thinking biblically. Vocation is found by looking without and asking what life is asking of us. What problem is addressed by an activity you intrinsically enjoy? Where does the world's great problem and your great passion meet? That is often advice that we give in the church to think about calling. Brooks affirms that humility is the path of good leadership, marked not by a leader's desire to be great, but as a steward for his organization. And this steward tries to pass it along in a slightly better condition than he found it. Now, he's sitting here and he's giving this picture of humility. It's not all in one place. I've kind of taken all these things together because I'm using this book to answer this question. What is the benefit? The benefit is that humility is the road to character, and it does all of these things: the character of a leader, the way that it's done, social, the goal of it, being expressed in social ways, finding your calling. But behind this all, don't lose fact of the primary point of the answer. Brooks' aim is to call us towards character. And so he sees pride as the central vice, which leads to the big me narcissism of modern society. Now, if you've been following all these lectures, thank you. And then, call to mind some of the things, and then we think about Bernard and his discussion. And he says, I don't know much about humility, but I know something of pride, and I know that if I battle against pride, then I'm moving in the direction of humility. And we see these things that move together. Now, humility is more than the opposite of pride, but arrogance, pride, vanity, egoism, humility helps against all of these things. Now, Brooks is sitting there and he's analyzing modern culture. And he says the problem is the big me narcissism of modern society. He sees the struggle against sin and aiming for virtue as the central drama of life. And this is where he's calling us back to a biblical worldview. And he's calling us to the idea of recognizing sin. To fight against our broken nature forms character. To not simply accept that the broken version of you is the true self that you should be living into. So I'll give you a long quote, and I think it's a good one. Character is built in the course of your inner confrontation. Character is a set of dispositions, desires, and habits that are slowly engraved during the struggle against your own weakness. You become more disciplined, considerate, and loving through 1,000 small acts of self-control, sharing, service, friendship, and refined enjoyment. If you make disciplined, caring choices, you are slowly engraving certain tendencies into your mind. You're making it more likely that you'll desire the right things and execute the right actions. But if you make selfish, cruel, or disorganized choices, then you are slowly turning this core thing inside yourself into something that is degraded, inconsistent, or fragmented. And I think that's an important description of understanding that, this battle that we're in, which is going to take our entire life, Um, it's all the small choices. I preached a sermon series a little more than a year ago about the chains that we end up putting on ourselves because of these small choices. And we don't pay attention until after making that small choice over and over and over, that chain becomes something that really binds us. Your chain could begin as simply as allowing yourself just to say mean, hurtful words. Maybe first under your breath, and then you say them louder, and then you actually say them where other people hear them, and then you actually spew them at others. And this path of anger and bitterness gets a hold of you, and it becomes more and more who you are. Whole pathways of addictions, whether sexual or chemical, and those become a chain. And it all begins with this small series of choices that you make. And what you're doing is you're ingraining a way, a pathway, a road. And it is not the way of Christ. It's actually the way of sin and death. But the way it works is that in place of that way that we've been walking, we learn to walk a new way. And the primary way that we learn to walk it is day in, day out, building new habits, a new way of thinking, of being, and it's all about a series of choices. It's where we put our focus. It's what we allow to occupy our minds. And Brooks is affirming that reality. And so what often takes place is that we think of this heroic ideal of some great battle. But the battle's already decided by all the small choices that you've made. It takes real training to be a warrior. And you and I are training in something right now. And it's all the choices that we make. And so either we're running this race of faith with the Lord, and Paul would say run it so as to win, or we're running some other race. It might just be the race of comfort. That lazy boy chair is one of the most dangerous things around us. He characterizes this struggle as a difference, and I think this is great, as a difference between building a resume or a eulogy. The resume is the title that is intended to impress, where the eulogy are those things that leave a lasting impression. It is in light of this project that Brooks makes this claim. In the struggle against your own weakness, humility is the greatest virtue. Humility is having an accurate assessment of your own nature and your own place in the cosmos. Humility is awareness that you are an underdog in the struggle against your own weakness. Humility is an awareness that your individual talents alone are inadequate to the tasks that have been assigned to you. Humility reminds you that you are not the center of the universe, that you serve a larger order. Now, you hear this, and there's a lot of truth to it. But now you're hearing it in light of all the other stuff that we've been listening to, and you go, okay, there's the cool side of humility. This sounds a lot like Bernard. It needs to be read in light of the fact that Brooks is battling against a mindset that has rejected the biblical account of the fall. The biblical account of the fall says there is fundamentally something broken within us. And this is why he hammers so hard on this negative side of the definition, this cool side of humility, is because in this big me narcissism, and I think he's accurate. I mean, I think this is the part where there's elements of our culture that in some ways have lost shame, have lost any sense of other than that it's about me and myself and the way it makes me feel. Brooks is calling for a moral realism about our condition. And so while the path forward includes the warm social and positive aspects of humility, His central focus is on the way humility checks our pride, and in there helps us get to the road towards character. So, benefit of humility, road towards character. Another benefit of humility, and I'm gonna, and I kind of cheated a little bit. I mean, not really, but what I ended up doing as far as naming the benefits is actually using the title of these different books that I kind of saved towards the end. So this next book is this next argument comes from a book that's called The Ascent of a Leader. It's written by some Christian authors. They've co-written this together, and what they're speaking to a Christian audience, and they're saying, if you want to be the leader that God has called you to be, if you want to be the very best leader you can be, then here's the path. And the very first rung, the very first step, the key that gets you on the ascent towards being the leader that you want to be according to this book is humility. So, what's the benefit of humility? Helps form character. What's another benefit of humility? It helps you become the best leader that you can be. Jim Collins, I think, would agree. If you want to be the very best leader you can be, you should relentlessly pursue humility. I make this statement with the support of Jesus Christ to Jim Collins. It's not hyperbole, it's not a pitch. Humility invests leader with credibility that inspires others to follow. I mean, if you remember, there's lots of definitions that we can give to being a leader, but one simple definition is a leader is somebody that others are following. And the very best type of leadership is the type of leadership that inspires trust and confidence where the people are choosing to follow because they want to. That's real leadership. And humility is one of these characteristics that is central, that inspires others, that when they see this in somebody else, that they sit there and go, here's somebody I'm willing to follow. Now, you need more than humility to be a leader, but true humility presumes. Now, so it's not the only thing as far as being a great leader. There's a number of character and qualities and even skills necessary to be a good leader, but humility is central. And and a little clue as far as just thinking through biblically. When you look at the New Testament and you think about the qualifications for church leaders, the focus is on character more than on functions. There's a place for functions, there's a place for skills, but the Holy Spirit will inspire us with abilities, but character formation is more difficult. So, my tendency is to look first to character and then to look at skills and competencies. And humility is central to this part of character. I already heard that argument. Now, humility is essential. It's a first step according to the ascent of a leader. It doesn't mean that there's not other skills needed. And then this little bit of a reminder, true humility, biblical humility, presumes dignity, power, and status. Dixon, Cloud, Robinson all affirm that reality. And then there's a part where if you're really exercising humility, it means that you have power or privilege that you could be using for selfish ends. But in humility, you are willingly choosing not to use those for yourself, but instead positioning yourself in a place of service for others. In The Ascent of a Leader, the three authors, Thrall, McNichol, and Meckelrath, writing from an openly Christian position, invite leaders to choose true greatness in leadership, and humility is the first step. They contrast two different ladders leaders can climb towards reaching the top of their leadership potential. The first ladder they call the capacity ladder. It is a ladder every leader climbs and has 4 rungs. It begins with the leader discovering his or her abilities. The next step is to harness the ability into talent and capacities that develop competency and expertise. The third step is being elevated into the actual position of leadership, and the top of the capacity ladder is the leader reaching their individual potential. By itself, they argue, this ladder is not enough, though sadly, it is the only ladder many leaders choose to climb. Loneliness, burnout, immaturity, and broken relationships are frequent outcomes of big leaders climbing the short ladder that we call capacity. And this is this idea of, okay, we can talk about competency in leadership. And it's part of it, but from a Christian perspective, it is not the most important. What you do does not matter as much as who you are. And who we are called to be is to be people who reflect the character of Christ. And when we reject the call of character transformation, we're basically rejecting the call of discipleship. It really calls our salvation into question. And then what do you have? If you want to look at capacity, one of the great examples of maybe one of the most incredible leaders in history is Alexander the Great. This young 20-year-old son of a king who ended up leading Greece in like 12, 13 short years to basically conquering all of pretty much the known world, and India was next. They knew of India and they were kind of on the verges of it, and he did incredible feats of organization, of military leadership. But if you don't know the story, he died. It's a little bit questionable about how he died, but it's said that he was buried with his hands and feet sticking out of the ground, because even though he had conquered the world, when he died, there was, now he has nothing. And it's that great warning that if you just climb the capacity ladder and you don't focus on the character ladder in the Christian life, it really means nothing. Who you are is more important than what you do. God could raise up stones to do whatever needs to be done. But instead, what he's done is he calls us to himself in relationship. And then he gives us the gift of serving in his name. And the service is grace. It doesn't earn our salvation. It's how we experience part of our salvation. I was made for this. So we've got to keep these things clear, and that's what they're writing about. Thrall and McNichol and McElrath admit they could have given many names to the second ladder because it produces a multitude of powerful benefits, but they decided to call it the character ladder. While it is already stated that character is key to great leadership and humility is the road to character, their discussion clarifies 5 pragmatic benefits of pursuing character through humility. So, an important little section about how to become a great leader, and this repetition of ideas. Character is central to great leadership. Humility is the road to character. But here are 5 character keys to great leadership that they offer. First of all, leaders should create grace-filled environments and culture that empower and uphold. And now we're starting to get to a practical side of how do you use your power privilege in service to others that helps lift others up. This is the humble leader actually doing what they're called to do. And they make this very good argument that you should create a grace-filled environment that empowers and upholds. This leads to environments where people feel safe, they grow up, they trust each other, they live authentically, they celebrate each other, they laugh a lot. And all of this has a very practical benefit, and it has been proven over and over. When you create that sort of environment, those people produce better. They flourish. And now work isn't just, it's not just producing and it doesn't feel like slavery. Well, it feels like what you were made for. And there's always this difference about when we freely choose to give something our all instead of being driven by a whip. A humble leader is somebody who learns to inspire, but also learns to protect and guard and nurture a certain way of being together in community that doesn't feel like being driven by a whip, but releases people to their full potential. And here this should be an aspiration for our church community, even as it should be an aspiration for any leader, Christian, in any context as you are creating cultures and environments and communities in which people work and live. Second, humility encourages leaders to nurture deep relationships that sustain and ground us. Instead of viewing people as a resource to use, the character ladder produces leaders who serve for the benefit of the people. And I'll read this quote. Capacity ladder only organizations strive for accountability in order to get things done, but they do so at the expense of people's hearts. When leaders lose the hearts of their people's productivity will suffer, creativity will wane, and initiative will die. Achieving a vision requires a unity of hand and heart, of vocation and soul. When the culture of an organization honors the achievement of a goal over the health of its people, leaders and followers will learn to hide their hearts in an attempt to reach their goals. And this is the part where humble leadership will recognize that you are there to serve, and the ends don't justify the means, because the people are the means, or there are the ends. Their lives, who they are in Christ, what God is doing in them is the most important thing. But on the character ladder, the depth of the influence is honored above the height of the position. Living the truth is more important than living for success. Instead of making hasty moves that may harm relational investments, character ladder leaders will protect relationships, even though commitment, patience, and time can be costly. Trust develops in such places, and people learn things about each other that they never knew before. There's a picture of how we should be, not only as a church, but in every relationship in the world. We want to go deeper. Humble leaders end up fostering communities where love and trust are nurtured and people make commitments beyond the task or the paycheck, but to the people, mission, and a community. They make this argument, this kind of commitment cannot be bought. You can't ever pay people enough to get there. It can only be won. Third, they remind us that our destiny, they remind us of our destiny. What are we really climbing towards? We can't be so short-sighted as just to keep our eyes focused on this age, this life, because our destiny is eternal life. The ultimate goal is God, and so the first rung of the ladder is recognizing that God is God and we are not. That ends up being their definition of humility. A lot of the cool side of humility in that. For humility actively lets us live towards our destiny by trusting God with outcomes and people. Now, on a practical side, I would just say that I think that's a huge point. Is you sit there and it's like, okay, we don't have guarantees about how everything will go. God is at work, and sometimes he works in very mysterious ways, and sometimes from the world's perspective it looks like failure and falling. But what we're concerned about is the character, the way of Christ, that we do things, and we really allow him to take care of the outcome. Because the ends don't justify the means. Because the real ends are always about the formation of Christ in human beings who are created in the image of God, whose destiny is eternity. And so we can't short circuit this thing, because the goal is character transformation and likeness of Christ. And so don't ever lose a sight of that. I mean, this is the part where, now you're getting a little bit of my passion in this, where you have C.S. Lewis, and he says, listen, folks, the only immortal things that you and I interact with are the people that we see in and out every day. Civilization, society, all of that stuff, it doesn't last forever. But these human beings that we interact with and that we play with, but sometimes we hurt and we jest, well, they're eternal. And their destiny is not always determined. And some of them are going to shine like the stars in the heaven, and some of them, if you were to see them today, they will be horrors because of where they're headed. But you and I have a part to play in drawing people in to the kingdom of light and helping rescue these people out of a Christless eternity. So, humility actively lets us live towards our destiny by trusting God with outcomes and with people. Finally, humility builds grit, perseverance as a humble leader trusts God with outcomes and serves the mission of the organization as a non-anxious presence of trust, hope, and love. We live into the faith of the promise. God raises up those who humble themselves. When you set aside your power and your privilege and you serve the people in the organization, and it may not fit the world's standard of success, it may not fit the world's idea of what winning looks like, but what you've done is the faithful call of Christ. You've left the outcome to him. But that's the part where now you've positioned yourself because you've actively engaged all of this in faith to allow God both to receive the glory and to give you your reward. Not the applause of people, but the applause of heaven. Third benefit of humility, something I've talked about before, but we'll flesh out now a little bit more. Humility is the counter virtue to pride. All through the literature, humility is seen as a counter to pride, where in the Christian tradition, pride is commonly acknowledged to be at the root of our rebellion against God and central to sin. It should come as no surprise that humility is so often described as the mother of virtues. If sin is the consequence of the fall, and sin is primarily defined as pride, and humility is the counter to pride, then humility becomes that mother of all virtues that helps overcome sin and lead us into life. And that's kind of a summary of most of our Christian tradition. In the wake of the fall of Christendom, the rise of the masters of suspicion, Freud, Nietzsche, Adler, that's wanting to push humility out because it wants to push Christianity out. And in the advent of therapeutic culture, that is the rise of psychology, and now we think about ourselves and our neuroses, and we go back and we say, what about your childhood? And we're trying to build up our sense of self-esteem, and anything that might threaten your self-esteem, like thinking less of yourself, becomes a threat. It should be clarified that the biblical notion of pride is presented without positive value. So the Bible presents pride as a sin. Moving forward into this new culture, that the biblical critique is basically pushed aside. But if we really want to understand the biblical definition, the biblical idea of pride, this is the part where, I think I often have conversations with people, because of our therapeutic culture, where we talk about this sense of, okay, well, I don't want to be self-loathing, so there's a healthy sort of a pride. That's true. And probably the way we would describe this as a Christian is that it's an appropriate self-estimate, or it's really accepting who God has created you to be, which is, I'm beloved. Jesus loves me so much that he died for me. I'm broken, I'm flawed. It's not the main thing about me. But in the therapeutic culture, in our modern culture that doesn't believe in God, that becomes a threat to your ego. How can I really like myself if I'm fundamentally broken? And well, if you have no hope of overcoming because you can't do it in your own effort, that's a little bit understandable. And so that becomes this part where there's a little bit in our modern culture where we're pushing aside, and pride is kind of seen as a positive. But that sort of pride, which says that you have value, is not the biblical idea of pride. So, biblically speaking, pride is not healthy self-esteem. It's not confidence from an accurate self-estimate. It's not admiration of excellence sought or achieved. There's a place that, you work really hard at something and you do a good job and you have a sense of pride in what you have done. Biblically speaking, when the Bible talks about pride as a sin, it's not talking about that sort of thing. The biblical notion of pride is always negative. It is inordinate self-love, arrogance, vanity, conceit, egotism, hyper-autonomy, grandiosity, pretentiousness, snobbishness, impertinence, haughtiness, self-righteousness, domination, selfish ambition, self-complacency, fundamentally rebellion against our Creator God. So when we talk about humility being the counter of pride, we're talking about pride in that biblical sense. All that negative stuff. You know it. You've met some people who are highly arrogant, and it just doesn't smell good. I mean, it's just like, it's, morally we'd say it's a little bit repugnant. It's like, man, it is so hard to be around this person because they are so into themselves. I mean, oh my goodness. And it would be nice if those people had a little more humility. When you think about the biblical idea of pride, you're thinking about all those negative things. It's not a healthy self-estimate. It's not having a sense of care about trying to do excellence in your work. It's all the negative stuff. And in that, humility helps overturn all those negative vices. A biblically informed practice of humility is a vice-destroying virtue that helps overcome a host of character flaws as well as leadership deficiencies. Now, I'm going to introduce another book. I didn't call the benefit of this. I introduced it with this idea that pride is that humility is the counter of pride. But it also becomes the counter to a whole bunch of other vices that specifically get in the way of leadership. Now, here's a book, Overcoming the Dark Side of Leadership. Gary McIntosh and Samuel Rima. They present 5 major dysfunctional traits that undermine and ruin leadership. Their study was born out of observing numerous moral failures of Christian leaders. It almost seemed, they observed, that if leaders were driven to experience failure in equal proportion to their success. This is where McElrath, McNichol, and Meckelthal, the Ascent of a Leader, they would say that one of the dangers that they've seen is a whole bunch of people climbing the capacity ladder without climbing the character ladder. And McIntosh and Rima are coming at this in the same sort of an issue, but they're more looking at the reality of the dysfunctions of what happens when you don't pursue the character ladder and you're only going the capacity ladder. And this is the part where it's open all over the place in leadership, in every sort of a thing. But they're Christians, and so they were paying particular attention to Christian leadership and really the failings of pastors who end up having some level of success, and yet it seems the higher they go, the greater their fall. And sadly enough, these are the ones that we often see across the newspapers and other media when we see some of these Christian leaders fall. So what they're looking at is that they're saying, here are 5 major dysfunctions And these dysfunctions will end up tripping up the leaders. And so if you understand the dysfunctions, and if you see your weaknesses and then you fight against it, this may help you avoid that great fall. Now, they never looked at the virtue of humility. They just were looking at these dysfunctions. So here, I'm listening to what they have to say, and what I realized was, in every instance, humility and the cultivation of humility and the cultivation of biblical humility would be a vice-destroying virtue that would actually help you overcome, concretely, specifically, this dysfunction. And this is something where I did a little bit something different in my literature review, because this was more generative, this was more creative on my part. I wasn't just describing something, but I was listening to a whole bunch of things, and then I went, okay, pay attention, folks, because this is significant. These are real leadership dysfunctions, and here's how humility will help. So, I'll offer these things to you. In many ways, they were looking at the wreckage caused by leaders who chose to climb the shorter capacity ladder without climbing the character ladder. The value of their study in is providing a more detailed understanding of personality character dysfunctions, how they manifest in leadership, and provide equipping resources for leaders to address those areas and to prevent or at least mitigate the potential negative effects to the exercise of leadership. It was a very practical book about really looking at your weaknesses, identifying what your weakness is, and then instead of allowing that weakness to perpetuate and trip you up, that you would be able to begin to cultivate those things that will help overcome those weaknesses. When McIntosh and Rima encourage leaders to consider receiving help from a professional counselor, they give only a very slight nod to the value of humility. And what they go is that, you know, they're sitting there and saying, here's a place where you might want to go and see a professional counselor, and oftentimes leaders aren't humble enough to go see a counselor, and that is the only place in the entire book that they talk about humility. But in their discussion of these 5 character dysfunctions, leadership dysfunctions, humility will help. So, the first dysfunction that they describe is the compulsive leader. And here are traits of a compulsive leader. They're very concerned about their status. They're very controlling. They're workaholics. They're moralistic and judgmental. And at the heart, compulsive leaders have an angry and rebellious attitude. Now, their book offers more as far as a description of that. But let me flesh this out as far as humility. The biblical idea of humility will help train us to have no concern over our status, which directly counters this trait of the compulsive leader who is all concerned about their status. Biblical humility seeks to serve, not control or condemn. And cultivating biblical humility will be a fight against that controlling and that condemning. The heart of a humble leader is filled with love and faith, trusting God with outcomes, and allowing the leader to be a non-anxious presence working towards godly and beneficent outcomes. In contrast, the heart of a compulsive leader will be filled with anger and rebellion. So, if you were to read through this book and you were to look at the traits of a compulsive leader, even though they never mention it, if you were to spend time cultivating humility, you could expect that humility would work against all of the major issues that are facing you in the threat of being a compulsive leader. A narcissistic leader, driven to succeed by a need for admiration and acclaim, overinflated sense of importance, At the heart of narcissistic leaders are self-absorption, uncertainty due to deep feelings of inferiority. And so now let me explain to you how humility will help in this instance. So a narcissistic leader is driven to succeed and has a need for admiration and acclaim. The pursuit of humility says you are no longer trying to win the acclaim of this world. Your status, your privilege, you are truly now living for the audience of one. You're going to humble yourselves before the world, trusting in God to lift you up. A humble leader accepts God's call, whether it means washing dishes, cleaning a mess, or leading an organization. Sense of importance is tempered by the practice of disregarding status. So instead of an overinflated sense of importance, and I'll remind you of kind of a practical example here. I have seen where that you can climb up so high in an organization, and then there are certain things that are just beneath you. But that's not humility getting formed. Sometimes, this is the part I'll share a little tension that I sometimes face is that, and it's a tension. There's the individual standing before me, and there's the 400 people that I'm going to be preaching to on Sunday. I have a call to both. And at some point, I have to prioritize attending to what I'm doing for 400 over the one. And then in the midst of that, there may be other things where it's like, okay, we need some help over here stacking some chairs. Okay, the toilet's flooding. I got to go grab a plunger and take care of that. And then you're looking at the team of people and who you have on hand, and it becomes the part about saying, okay, it would make more sense if you go and take care of the toilet. I'll stack the chairs and I'll go prepare the message. And in that, there's that part where all you're doing there is trying to manage the circumstances and utilize everybody's gifts and talents. But there's a big difference between that and getting to the place where you think, well, as a senior pastor, there's just no possible way that I should have to clean a toilet. Why not? It'd be a good thing. It'll keep you in your place. So that becomes that tension of, you can see that narcissism of entitlement get built in, but the cultivation of humility that says, I'm just here to serve, and sure, I can clean some toilets. That's not a big deal. That will go right against the narcissism. The heart of a humble leader exhibits both selflessness and faith in God's promise to honor and reward. At the heart of narcissistic leaders are self-absorption and uncertainty due to deep feelings of inferiority. True humility will get us to a place where we'll go, I know exactly who I am. I'm beloved. That's why I do the things that I do. I know His love, and I don't have to worry about what other people think. I'm just here to serve. And it will help you overcome the narcissism, which will tear you down. Okay, we didn't get through quite everything, but we're making our way. I hope that you are finding this practically helpful, just some of these things, thinking through these practical benefits. Humility is going to help us become more healthy. Humility is going to become us more better leaders. Humility is going to help us be conformed and transformed in the likeness of Christ. So, with that, have a wonderful night. God bless, and I will see you next week.